CtrlAble here. As a disabled Nintendo gamer, I think one of the most interesting things about Trails in the Sky First Chapter is that it does not just remake and port the RPG. It reintroduces an entire series in a way that feels dramatically more approachable, without stripping away what made people love in the first place. And honestly, that matters a lot more than I think some people will. Because from the outside, the Trails series can feel intimidating. It is long, interconnected, full of lore and names, regions, systems, arcs, and history. For many people, that kind of reputation creates friction before they even touch game. It creates this sense that you are already behind, like you need homework to begin. That kind of barrier is real, and from an accessibility and player experience standpoint, it matters. A game can be amazing, but if its structure makes people feel locked out before they even start, that affects who actually gets to enjoy. That is why Trails in the Sky First Chapter feels so important. What Falcom seems to understand here is that accessibility is not just about options and menus. It is also about whether a game gives new players a clear and welcoming entry point. And from everything people keep highlighting about this remake, that is exactly what this game is trying to be. It is taking a title that already had the reputation of being the best starting point in the series and making that starting point feel modern, readable, and far less intimidating. And that starts with the presentation. The shift to full 3D, the updated cutscene direction, the more expressive character animation, stronger visual clarity, and the voice scenes all seem to make this version of Liberal feel more immediate and easier to connect with emotionally. That matters because one of the biggest accessibility advantages a remake can have is reducing the distance between the player and the experience. Older presentation styles are not bad, but sometimes they require newer players to put in extra effort to decode tone, follow pacing, or connect with player and character moments. Here, it sounds like Trails in the Sky First Chapter closes that gap. And Estelle is a huge reason this works. A lot of people keep coming back to how much personality she has in this remake. Her facial expressions, her energy, her warmth, her impulsiveness, her humor. That is important because strong character readability helps carry slower paced RPGs. If a game is asking you to invest in a long journey, the cast has to feel alive enough to make that investment feel natural. And from what I've seen in all these impressions, Estelle and Joshua do exactly that. Estelle brings that headstrong, bright, emotionally open energy, while Joshua adds restraint, mystery, and calm. That contrast seems to anchor the whole game. But what really stands out to me is that the game does not seem in a rush to prove itself through spectacle alone. A lot of modern games try to hook people by going huge right away. Trails in the Sky First Chapter sounds like it does something different. It lets the world breathe. It builds through place, routine, local problems, outside quests, relationships, and a gradually expanding perspective. A slower structure can be a strength when handled well. For some players, especially players who value immersion, clarity, and steady emotional investment, a slower burn is not a flaw. It is what gives the later payoff its power. That said, slow pacing only works when the world is strong enough to support it, and that seems to be where this remake really shines. Everything I keep reading points to Liberal feeling rich, lived in, and layered. Towns are not just stops on a map. They seem to have history, identity, social texture, and a sense of progression. NPC dialogue changing constantly, regions having their own atmosphere, side quests reinforcing what bracers actually mean to ordinary people. Collectible reading like the Liberal news adding context to the wider world. That stuff matters. It is not fluff, and it's what makes a world feel like a place instead of a backdrop. And from a disabled gamer's perspective, I think there is something especially important about that kind of design. When a game gives you meaningful reasons to slow down, check in, explore, and absorb the environment, it creates a different relationship with pace. It does not make every second about pressure. It gives the experience room to breathe. That can make a huge difference for players who get overwhelmed by constant intensity. or who want a game that feels inviting, wherever van we land. Now, one of the smartest things this remake appears to do is modernize friction without flattening depth. That is a huge deal. Fast travel, map markers, more visible quest structure, easier tracking for missables, better handling of hardy equipment, and all these other quality of life improvements might sound small in isolation. However, together they completely change how approachable a long JRPG feels. This is the kind of stuff that does not always get treated as accessibility, even though it absolutely affects accessibility. Not everyone wants to constantly cross-check guide, backtrack unthinkingly, or worry that the game is punishing them for not reading its mind. Reducing that friction does not make the game shallow. It makes the game more respectful of the player's time and attention. And I think that same balance shows up in combat too. The hybrid system sounds like one of the most interesting parts of the remake. You have quick real-time combat for weaker enemies, but the game still preserves the deeper tactical turn-based side for fights that actually demand more thought. And that is a really smart design direction because it addresses two different kinds of player friction at once. One, it reduces the drag of trivial encounters. Two, it still leaves room for strategic depth when the combat actually matters. That is the kind of balance I wish more RPGs thought about, because not every fight needs the same level of commitment. Letting players burn through weaker enemies faster while still engaging deeply with bosses and harder encounters helps with pacing, cognitive load, and overall flow. And based on all the discussion around the turn manipulation, ordnance, crafts, art, S-crafts, and positioning, it sounds like the game still gives people plenty to dig into once it wants you to engage more seriously. That said, the game still sounds system heavy in a very Trails way. There are still many turns, mechanics, menus, and layers to understand. Ordnance, courts, set arts, crafts, EP, CP, all of that can still create some onboarding friction, especially for newer players. So I would not frame this as a game that suddenly stops being dense. I would frame it more as a game that seems much better at helping players cross that initial threshold. And that distinction matters. Good onboarding does not mean removing complexity, it means making it easier to enter. That is why I think this remake feels like such an important project. It is not just preserving a classic, it is recontextualizing it for players who may have always been curious but never felt the series truly met them halfway. And I also think the Switch angle matters here. A lot of people are pointing out that Trails in the Sky First Chapter feels great on Nintendo platforms, especially Switch 2, and I think that matters because portability changes the rhythm of a long RPG. Games like this can thrive when they fit more naturally into real life. A long, story-rich, chapter-based RPG with lots of dialogue, lots of side content, and a steady sense of progression can work extremely well in portable form because it supports chipping away at the world over time. For players managing energy, focus, time, or comfort, that flexibility is not small. It can be the difference between a game feeling manageable and one that feels like too much. Of course, it sounds like the remake isn't perfect. A few people have pointed to dialogue that feels a little restrained or awkward in places, some localization debate, some menu clunkiness, and the fact that this is still very much the first part of a larger story. That last point is especially important. It's not a fully self-contained narrative. It sounds satisfying in its own right, but it also clearly ends by pushing you toward what comes next. For some players, which still feels exciting. For others, it may feel like a commitment warning. But honestly, I think that is part of what makes Trails in the Sky First Chapter so fascinating. It is a beginning in the truest sense, not just beginning of a plot, but the beginning of investment, the beginning of understanding why this series has such an intense following, the beginning of realizing that the appeal of Trails is not just big lore or lots of games, but the way it makes small moments, local stories, and personal relationships feel like the foundation of something much bigger. And from where I sit as a disabled Nintendo gamer, that is part of why I find it most compelling. Because the best entry points are not the ones that explain themselves better, they are the ones that make you want to stay. They make the world feel worth learning. They make the system feel worth understanding. They make the time feel worth giving. And Trails in the Sky first chapter really sounds like it understands that. It sounds like a remake that is not just trying to impress old fans, it is trying to invite new people in. And honestly, for a series with a reputation this massive, that might be the smartest thing Falcom could have done. CtrlAble here, let me know in the comments, do you think a great JRPG entry point is more about simplifying systems or about making the world and characters strong enough that you want to learn them anyway?